Synopsis: Lila, a restless photographer turned writer, is tasked with creating the centerpiece for a city gallery's show called Prompts, an exhibition of images that must tell whole stories at a glance. Haunted by a missing piece of her own past, she searches for an image that will liberate her voice. Her hunt leads her to Elias, an elderly painter whose canvases have a way of waking memory. Given a single, strange painting, a doorway into dusk, a child with a jar, blue beads scattered like lost teeth, a woman turned away, Lila stages the painted scene as a living photograph with the help of Omar, the gallery's pragmatic curator, and Sarah, a quiet young woman who becomes both subject and mirror. As they wrestle with light, objects, and memory, the painting threads their lives together, unspooling a long, buried truth about family, blame, and leaving. The story is a cinematic meditation on how an image can be a key, a wound, and a promise, a picture prompt that fits exactly. At last, with a whole life, the gallery smelled like lemon oil and cold coffee. Omar had left the blinds half open, and the light sliced through the window in knife-edge panels that made the photographs on the wall look like scenes from films. Lila stood in the center of the room, hands jammed into her jacket pockets, and watched a dozen pictures she had not taken: friends, landscapes, strangers caught in little acts of decision. The show's title, PRMPTS, was painted on a card propped against a stack of frames in Omar's handwriting. Clean, deliberate. "We need an image that's a story," he said, as if reciting a brief. "One frame, whole narrative. We put that in the center. The rest orbit it. People should walk in and want to read the life beyond the frame." Alila's laugh was short. She had been turning phrases into something like netting for months, trying to catch a single idea steady enough to hold the rest of herself. The commission felt like the wrong kind of mercy, a demand that her grief perform. She pressed her lips together and tried to imagine a picture that could wear the weight of her past and not cave. Her past, she thought, was mostly a series of doors she had closed. She had learned to make her life a succession of small exits, cameras, dark rooms, trains. "You always make things mean more," Omar said, softening, standing beside her. He had the face of someone who had stored grief and polished it until it looked respectable. He ran a thumb along the edge of a frame, and dust motes rose like tiny planets. "Make it mean something, sure, but it has to be clear." "What about a photograph of the gallery?" Lila said reflexively, and immediately felt foolish. She closed her eyes and could hear only the half-memory of a child's laugh and the click of a shutter, like a small, steady heart. "It's not about meaning, it's about resonance." Omar smiled at her the way someone smiles at a stubborn engine that might yet start. "You'll find it. You always do." He put their agreement in a neat, professional envelope: the show date, a small stipend, the expectations. When he left the room, he moved like a man with a map. Layla walked home along streets that remembered rain. The city held winter like a secret and softened edges into charcoal. She had the painting idea the way one sometimes has a sound in the back of the throat, present and unnamed. She wanted, more than anything, an image that did not simply illustrate, but that invited the viewer to step inside and find the same she carried. She wanted a picture that fit with a story the way a thumb might fit the hollow beneath a chin. It was Elias who offered it. She found him tucked behind a row of old shops that smelled of oil and boiled spices. His studio was a third-floor room with a slanted ceiling, windows frosted from decades of weather. Paint-splattered teacups clustered on the sill. Canvases leaned against the walls like sleeping people. Elias moved slowly, as if each step required negotiation with gravity, and his hair was the color of old paper. He greeted her with a nod, and the faint suspicion of a man who had been living inside his paintings for so long they had started to look back. "You're the photographer," he said. His voice was coarse with paint dust and something like patience. He hadn't asked her name. "I'm Layla," she said. "Omar said you might." The sentence fell away beneath the passing of a fly, then a laugh bubbled up in her, dislodging the nervousness in her chest. "He said you painted prompts." Elias's mouth twitched. "Prompts," he repeated, as though turning the word in his mouth tasted like metal. "I paint what people keep elsewhere. People come in curling from their own edges and ask for a map. That's exactly what I need." Her words were fast because what she wanted to say was heavy. "I need a picture that's a whole story. Not a scene that points at a story, but one that contains it." Elias stood, the joints in his hands making small complaints. He draped a blanket over a canvas, as if guarding it, then pulled it away. The painting underneath was modest, maybe 30 by 40, oils layered like thin glass. It showed a narrow doorway the color of late dusk, opening onto nothing but sky. In the foreground, a child squeezed a glass jar so tight the light bent around it, beads blue as winter spilled in a slow, small river across a wooden step. The child's face was turned, so you saw only the line of an ear and the fall of hair. Beyond the door, a woman turned away, collarbone catching the last light, and far off, the suggestion of a sea lantern blinked like an anxious star. Lila felt her breath leave her in a single, surprised exhale. The room narrowed around that exhale, and then widened again. She did not own the words that could explain why the sight of those beads, glass and cool and absurdly vivid, made her throat ache. She felt everything shift in the way it does when a seam is found and a garment lets go. "You painted it?" she asked. "Once," Elias said, "for someone who could not return." He folded his hands, as if folding some memory into a pocket. He didn't look at her directly. "You asked for a picture that could hold a story. This painting has held one. It might help you find the story you already have." He wrapped the canvas slowly, as if the painting itself might slip away if handled too briskly. He did not ask for money. He only took the slip of paper Lila gave him and wrote something on the back, 3 letters and a number, and said, "Pictures are doors. They don't tell you what is on the other side, they only show you the threshold." Lila carried the wrapped canvas home beneath her coat like contraband. It fit against her chest and beat with her own quick pulse. In the small apartment she shared with a slow, patient plant and a stack of novels, the painting seemed to enlarge the room. She opened it on her kitchen table. The beads glinted the way glass does when you hold it under a stream of sun, without life, yet catching everything. She slept badly that night. Once, in the dark between one dream and another, she found herself standing at the edge of water, small lights scattering on the surface like fish. A child's hand held hers. A hand she realized suddenly had belonged to someone she had loved with a kind of raw, unthinking ferocity. Her heart clutched, and the name that sluiced through her like cold water was a name she had not spoken in 20 years. Amen. When she woke, the name tasted as if it had been dragged out of something deep. She did not tell Omar. She had a private sense that this painting was not a commercial prop, but a patient instrument. She called Sarah instead. Sarah had sat for Leela once, months earlier, in a studio that smelled of wet paper and lemon. She had a face that looked younger than she was and eyes that sat too still as if waiting for permission to move. She worked in a bakery by night and took selfies in broken light. Leela liked how she could inhabit an expression and then shed it. She texted, and Sarah said she could come over any afternoon. The shoot was an exercise in coaxing an atmosphere into being. Leela wanted the photograph to be, literally, the painting made flesh. They found an old wooden door at a secondhand store. Varnish eaten by time, bolt still functional. Lila polished a jar until it sang against her palms and lined up beads on a plate, their blue arresting like plucked stars. Omar came with lamps and grids, He organized light like a man setting a stage where a small, private tragedy could be stopped and looked at. He had the neat hands of someone who could make a room speak without shouting. They worked for 2 days. Sarah's hair fell into her face in the way the painting suggested, and Lila kept thinking the child in the canvas could be anyone and no one. 1,000 possible selves. At night, Lila would drift into the painting's shadow and remember smells frying oil, saffron, the iron tang of the river in monsoon. Images came in shards. A festival lantern rolling on a rope, a woman's hand unclasping a necklace, a small jar catching light before it rolled and shattered. And each shard tasted like a promise she had not yet been brave enough to accept. The more precisely they arranged the scene, the more memory uncoiled. Leela sometimes felt the camera as a surgeon's hand, excising a sliver of truth and holding it up for inspection. The shutter clicked, and with each click a film of her past peeled away. It turned out memory, like light, needed the right focus to become visible. Sarah arrived one evening carrying a paper bag of warm, sticky buns. She had found a blue bid tangled in the strap of an old bag and unwittingly tucked it into her palm. She showed Lila with the timid reverence of someone revealing a relic. Layla's breath hitched. The bead looked exactly like the ones in the painting. The same shade of small, impossible winter. Layla felt the air thicken. The room took on the feeling of a place where something could be confessed. Omar says the painting is by Elias, Sarah said, biting gently into a bun. Her language was spare but honest. He also says not to call it prophetic. That's what he calls it in the shop, prophetic. Like it knows more than it has the right to. It's not prophetic, Layla said, though her voice did not manage the firm edge she wanted. It felt as if saying the word too often would give it teeth. The shoot continued. They placed the jar, then tipped it, then let the beads spill across a step. Sarah crouched as if she were the child. Lila asked her to hold the look of someone who did not yet know the meaning of the jar. And then again, the look of someone who did. The variations produced small griefs that smelled of old kitchens and iron. Omar watched, snapping light into frames, his face shut politely. On the second day, while they were breaking down the set, an old woman stopped on the sidewalk outside the studio. Her scarf was faded to the color of last year's sky. She stood and stared at the doorway there, as if it were a photograph she could not let go. Lila went to the window and recognized the slight stoop of someone who had once been young. The woman tapped the glass and walked up the stairs as if remembering a route she had walked 1,000 times. "Elias?" she asked when he opened the door. He blinked as though someone had spoken in a language he had half remembered. They hugged with a reserve that carried the mutual familiarity of people who had once been intimate with the same calamity. The woman's hands trembled. She held a small tin box. "My name is Amina," she said to Lila when the introduction came. And in that single syllable Lila felt the room tilt. It was like the sudden recognition of a face in a crowd. Amina looked at the painting, and her mouth made the beginning of a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You know this picture," Leela said before she could stop herself. Her voice came low, and there was an urgency to it, a sound of someone holding the edges of a wound steady. Amina's eyes moved to Leila. They were the same shade as the beads. "I know that night," she said simply. "Or, rather, I know a night like that." She opened the tin box. Inside lay a few blue beads, a torn strip of embroidered cloth, and a small, tarnished locket. Her hand stroked them, as if they were breathing. Elias watched them both with the slight smile of someone who knows that stories do their work when no one forces them to. "Pictures are doors," he murmured again, and this time his voice did not sound like a proverb but a confession. "They don't tell, they remember." Over the next weeks, the photographs were printed, matted in white, and placed beside Elias's painting in the gallery. Lila had titled the piece simply THRSOLD. At the opening, the room was a constellation of private griefs. People moved around the painting and the photograph like pilgrims around an altar, murmuring and positioning themselves in certain lights. There were critics with warm coats and students with notebooks, lovers and strangers who lingered at the corner and then left with something pressing their chest. Lila felt exposed in a way she had not permitted herself. A body on display could still be private. A remembered thing on display could not be taken back. Then, mid-evening, when the room hummed like a pot left to simmer, Sarah walked to the painting and stood utterly still. Her cheeks were pale, and the beads she had found at the shoot had been sewn into the lining of her jacket. Her small mouth opened and closed on a breath, like someone drawing a blade out of a sheath. Lila watched her and knew the look, the exact upright, tender, ragged stance of a person who had found a missing piece. The crowd, sensing the change, hushed. A dozen phones turned, light like a flock of moths. Amina, who had come for reasons she refused to articulate, was at Layla's side as if she had an appointment with her own past. The gallery, built as it was of glass and oak, allowed a winter light that made everything look sharper. The painting's beads caught and multiplied that light. "You've brought it home," Amina said, to Lila or to the painting. It was impossible to tell. Her voice was the sound of someone trying to remember the texture of someone's hair. "I thought I'd never see it again." Lila felt wind pass through the hollow in her chest. "Why did you leave?" she asked before she had decided she could bear the answer. The question fell into the space between them like a small stone. Amina's fingers found the edge of the frame. For a moment, she seemed a child again, learning how to use hands that could both hold and let go. "I didn't leave because I wanted to be free," she said. "I left because the house could not breathe." "Your father." She stopped. The words clustered like birds in a net. "He drank the roof over our heads. He got angry in ways that made small things bleed. I took money I shouldn't have, borrowed from people with no patience. One night, the men came. I left with the jar because it was the only small thing I could trust to be whole." Layla's face burned. She had grown up with a story that Amina had chosen to leave them, that she had preferred other lives. Her memory had made Amina into an abstraction, someone who walked away. Hearing the small, agitated secrecy of Amina's confession, the thieves of pride, the sound of men outside a door, filled the spaces between Layla's ribs with a slow, hot ache of betrayal and of understanding. She had loved that idea of abandonment because it let her anger be sharp, focused, and not diffuse with pity. To have it complicated with fear and duty was to be given a different shape of grief. "And Amin?" Layla asked. The name uncoiled like a bell. It was a small and ancient commandment to say it. Amina's hands moved as if in a dream. "It was my fault," she said, and for the first time a woman's face seemed to crack into the reality of her own culpability. "I left him on the step to take water. I told him to hold the jar. I came back, and he was not there. The canal was high. The police said I should have watched him. People said I should have never gone. I kept the jar because I thought if it was whole, maybe he was too. I couldn't find him. I couldn't find myself." Lila closed her eyes. The memory that rose then was not neat. It was an odor and a shape. The way Amin's laugh rose like a small bell, the smell of frying and the wet rope, the way a lantern had bobbed and then gone. The image of a jar slipping from small hands and the beads bleeding across a step returned as if it had been waiting for a light strong enough to show it. "You left because you were afraid," Lila said, then winced. The words were too thin. Fear was a poor scaffold to build a life on. "You left and you kept a jar." "I kept it because it kept me honest," Amina said. I carried the thought that if I kept that jar, I was keeping evidence that he had existed and not simply slipped like a rumor. Being in another city, I worked nights and I learned to be small. I wrote to no one. For years, I thought keeping myself alive was enough proof of devotion. It was a bad ledger. Lila felt something like forgiveness rise in her, not because a story had been neatly resolved, but because truth made the thin edges of blame dull and unlovely. The painting and the photograph had not told her what to feel. They had shown a threshold and allowed her to step. She stepped. "I thought you chose," she admitted, and said the word aloud as if confessing a petty crime. "I thought you chose us to be unimportant." Amina's eyes filled, a surprise like rain. "I thought leaving would mean I could search faster," she said, and laughed the single, raw, honest laugh of someone who had practiced saying a confession in the dark. "It never is faster. The world keeps being round." After the opening, the city folded them into its ordinary pattern. Reviews came with the right adjectives: haunting, precise, elegiac. Leela read them quietly, put them in a drawer. The painting stayed in the center of the gallery as promised. People continued to stand before it and try to make their own narratives align with the beads and the door. Omar grinned once at Leela and then resumed the business of being a curator and tending to other people's stories. Elias came less often to the gallery after that night. When he did arrive, he stood a respectful distance from Tirishuoldi. He would pat the frame with the gentleness of a man touching something alive. Once, when the gallery emptied and only midnight light pooled on the floor, he found Lila arranging a small stack of prints. He sat on a folding chair and watched her. "You did well," he said. "I didn't do anything other than let light do its job," Leela replied, and for a long minute they sat in the common language of people who made things. "Why did you paint it?" Elias looked at the small, stubborn woman on the other side of the room and smiled, a tired, satisfied thing. "I painted because the night had a face and needed to be understood by someone who wasn't ready to forgive themselves. I painted because sometimes a thing needs to be made visual before the hand can do what the mind is frightened to do. I painted because I believed that if someone saw the beads, they might tell the truth. And did you expect it to be me?" He flicked a cigarette into a tin, though he never smoked inside. "I expected someone to find the threshold. People keep walking past their past for years, thinking they are moving forward. But forwards and backwards meet sometimes across the same step." Sarah stayed in Lila's life after the show. They developed a strange, quiet friendship that sometimes felt like the belonging of found things in a jar. She baked and delivered small, sweaty loaves of bread, and sometimes Lila would find her at strange hours, reading with the kind of concentration that made her forget to blink. Amina visited, and they met for tea in rooms where the sunlight fell at a forgiving angle. The three of them sat around Elias's canvas, sometimes speaking and sometimes letting silence do the work of repair. Leela finished the novel she had been unable to write for years. It did not come out whole at once. It arrived in small, patient segments, like a stitchwork. The book was not a memoir and not entirely fiction. It was a braided thing that kept one hand on fact and one hand on making. On the back cover, Leela wrote, with Omar's patient help, a line that would not have fit anywhere at the gallery opening. "A picture can be a threshold. Sometimes you only need the courage to step through." When the book was published, people wrote letters with their own versions of the jar and the beads. They described thresholds that had been invisible until a light fell in the right angle. They wrote about mothers who left and returned, brothers remembered, photographs that acted like compasses. Lila answered some of the letters and folded others into a trunk she kept under her bed, as if proof and correspondence could be arranged into some sort of ledger against forgetfulness. On a day that felt like the first page of spring, Lila walked back to the studio where Elias kept his canvases. He was there, older perhaps, his hands tremor, prone as he mixed a small amount of paint. He handed her a wrapped thing. "For you?" he said. "A token." She opened it and found a small, blue bead, the color of the sea before it forgets light. It fit in the hollow of her palm like an apology. Elias watched her hold it as if it mattered what she decided to do with that tiny, glass world. Lila turned the bead in her fingers. It was nothing and everything at once, a fragile, round, a pocket of history. She thought of thresholds and doors, of the way a single image had opened a room inside her she hadn't known she possessed. "Thank you," she said. He only nodded. "Paintings," he said slowly, "are patient things." Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent and generous. Layla walked home past the river where, in a different season, a child had once laughed and been taken away by the sheer, tender cruelty of tide. The jar of her memory sat, intact in her mind, not as evidence of a crime, but as something she carried to remember that love could survive being lost. She was not whole in the tidy way the world sometimes promises. There were still days when the beads felt heavy in her pocket, but the image had been a door, and she had chosen to step through it. In the weeks that followed, people continued to stand before Ash Ld, tilting their heads so that the beads caught the light. Some wept softly and moved on. Others argued and returned to their coffee. Children pointed and imagined the beads as candies and the doorway as a passage to a pirate ship. All of them took something away. The painting did not answer them, it simply waited. It had been, after all, only a picture. But it had fit a life, and for Lila that was finally enough.